I'd be home by 9. Hell, I tell her that most of the time. Whoa, baby, don't know, won't hurt her too much. Whoa, I'll tell her where, but I won't say what. Oh, now I'm dancing, oh, I'm dancing. I'm dancing with the devil. Oh, now I'm dancing.
Hey guys, welcome to Otter Creek in Rio Grande. So if you've been watching the channel and keeping up with the community tab, you'll know that I've got a lot of work done here on the turntable. And so I thought I probably better produce another video and kind of get you caught up with where we're at right now. So what I'm going to try and do is just follow along and do a voiceover with what I've done and talk you through what happened. So if you recall from the previous videos, the next thing I wanted to concentrate on was getting the electricity to the rails, the DCC to the rails. And I really didn't like the way the instructions wanted you to go about doing it. It involved running a wire to the top of the gallows, down on the side of the gallows, over to some other place on the turntable, and then somehow soldering it to the rail, and then the other wire came up through the bottom somewhere else to a scraper on the bridge. So what I decided to do was to create my own commutator, and I did it out of evergreen plastic. I believe this is 40 thou, and I stacked up several pieces. I don't remember how many now, and just filed and measured and glued and just kind of built it up until it was the right size. And then after I got it, the size that I wanted, I took a file and just kind of created two troughs where a scraper could run at a later date. And I don't think I got any video of that, but you'll see here in a minute what I'm talking about. So it's a nice press fit, and I got plenty of clearance in there. And the next thing that I needed to do was figure out how am I going to get the wires up through there in a way that they weren't going to interfere with anything. So I just chiseled out or drilled out some of the plastic and made it to where that wire could go from the bottom all the way to the top of the plastic, and then I fold it over and solder it to some copper. And I went with some copper tape. I tried a few other things, but I couldn't find anything bendy enough to go around that tight of a radius, and the copper tape just worked pretty good. Now if you look real close here, you can see the troughs that I was talking about. That one in the middle is a complete separation of the tape so that, obviously your left rail and right rail aren't touching. And you can see the white wires going to the bottom and the blue wires going to the top. I had a little bit of clearance issues to begin with. You can see it's grabbing the wires right there. So I just went in and with some files and cut reliefs there in the bottom of the bridge to where they would clear that wire very easily. And that took care of all of my clearance problems. So the next step was to figure out the scrapers, and I just took some copper PCB ties from, those are scraps from Fast Tracks, and just kind of figured out where they needed to be on the inside. And there you can, if you look close enough, you can see where I've bent one over. And this took a little bit of effort to get it glued in the right place, and then even after I got it glued in the right place, I did have to do some bending of the scraper itself, and that's, I believe, phosphorus bronze wire. I can't remember how big it was, but there's the end product, and one's bent up a little bit higher than the other so that they should ride appropriately with rail A and rail B as they interface with the commutator. Now, I didn't film it, but I marked where these holes needed to be so that the pedestal could come straight down on top of there with the wires going through. And we have a bridge that spins pretty easy and has some electricity going to it, some DCC. So after I got that done, I figured I needed to take my attentions back to the pit, and just a lot of gluing in of the ties. And if you'll remember, I glued in concrete slabs, if you will, made of evergreen styrene, and I made those about the right size I needed, that if you put a tie in on every joint, everything would space out what it needed to be, and then one more tie would go in between each of the joints on the concrete. And I used just regular carpenter's glue. Now, the next big challenge that I was faced with was bending the rail at a constant radius and the correct radius to get it to fit inside the center of the pit, equal distance from left to right. And I tried it the first time with 2 pieces of 18-inch rail, and it just didn't work. And here you can see a picture of where the bridge aligns with the rail, and so it just wasn't going to work. And this is a picture of the metal wheel that rolls on the bottom of the bridge, and you could see there was a few places in there where it would fall out of the bridge and get wedged in the rail. So I really need to go with a different approach. So what I did, I measured from wheel to wheel and came up with what the radius needed to be, and checked that radius and adjusted this wood template here that would be able to use as a guide to bend the rail. And I just slowly bent this piece of rail until it ended up being the radius that it needed to be for the pit. And then once I got it bent to the correct radius, instead of using 2 pieces of 18-inch rail, I sacrificed a piece of flex track 36 inches and got one nice long continual piece of rail. And you can see it really distorts the beginning and the end of the rail when you push it through that rail bender. So I just kind of manipulated it a little bit by hand, and then overlapped and figured out where it needed to be, marked it, cut it, and then trial and error got it to fit inside the pit reasonably well. No matter how hard I tried, you're probably just not going to get a perfect round circle of rail. So the next thing I tried to do was create a tool, a jig, that could set that radius anywhere in the pit, and so kind of provide a template to where to spike and stretch the rail where it should be. And here I'm just using the bandsaw and trying to cut it as neat as possible. Now, this tool really did not work. It worked as a good "this will work," but the tool itself didn't work because I ended up splitting it because I needed to have a hole big enough in the tool that would go around the commutator. So you can see that's kind of the idea there. And here's the new tool. I built it out of masonite, and all in all it worked pretty good. I didn't end up with a perfect circle, and there's a few places in there where it pulls off of perfect center, but the metal wheels are wide enough that in the long run it didn't cause me any problems. And here's the table hooked up to DCC. Got the rail in, and it spins nice and free, and this was a pretty successful venture. Now, another thing that I did is I shimmed up the entire pedestal by 40 thousandths of an inch, and I did this primarily so that the metal wheels, there was zero chance that any weight was riding on the wheels of the bridge. If the bridge balances well, then there's not going to be any resistance from the wheels. Now, the end result meant that the bridge rode a little bit higher than what the instructions called for, but it turned out pretty good because the distance that you get from one bridge tie to the ground level there ends up being about the correct distance for a piece of N-scale cork roadbed. So it was time to paint the bridge now, and I started by just cleaning the whole thing with alcohol, making sure that all of my greasy meat hand fingerprints weren't on it anywhere. And I couldn't find my masking tape anywhere, so I ended up using cotton swabs to mask off where the scrapers were going to run. Now here is Mr. Hobby's Mr. Metal Primer. I'm using the old dunk the can in the hot water trick. So the theory behind that is that it raises the temperature of the propellant and kind of makes everything spray and work better. I do that with all of my spray bombs. So the first color I went with was Tamiya Flat Black, and I can't recall what the X number is. It's XF something. And trying to get all the cotton out of the way, which it didn't end up causing me any problems, but it's frustrating when you can't find something you have. And I'm still new to airbrushing, so if you see anything I'm doing obviously wrong here, well, this is not a how-to channel. This is what I did channel. I'm just trying to make sure I got full coverage everywhere. I didn't mess with any of the direct bottom of the bridge because it will never be seen. Now, if you'll notice on the end of the bridge there's a piece of styrene plastic that I used to hold the wheels in. That was another issue that I was having with the fitment of the bridge and how it interfaced with that single rail, is that there was a potential for the wheel to fall completely out, and so I just super glued a little bit of styrene on the bottom of there so that wheel couldn't come out. Now I'm using again Tamiya, I believe this is aluminum. I'll put it up here like right now so that you know what I actually used. And I think if I were to do this again, I would probably go with something just a little bit brighter than what I did. Now I didn't film it, but I did clear coat it first with some VMS satin, and now I'm using some oils in some white mineral spirits, and what I'm trying to do is just take away the brand new look of the bridge and give it just a light coat of dust. And you really can't see it on film, and even to the naked eye it was very subtle. I probably could have gone a little heavier than I did, but I figured it's easier to add than it is take away. Now here, you know, is things have progressed pretty far from here. I'm still fighting the cotton. Everything you see here is all done with oils, and it was just a matter of pin washing and, you know, laying it on and then taking it back off, as a lot of people will say. You know, it's just a matter of moving things around and getting the look you want. Now that real ugly black spot that you see there, that happened because I attempted to use acrylics and alcohol, and the alcohol just ate through that VMS varnish like it wasn't even there. So word to the wise, if you've used VMS varnish, alcohol will go right through it. And this is just going to be a series of pictures kind of showing the gradual building of the different layers. On the end where the motor is, I tried to make it a little grimier than the rest of the bridge. And you can kind of see here, this is why I was thinking I should have gone with something a little bit brighter. And especially once you get the bridge on top of it, you know, it kind of casts a shadow on the bridge on the underneath side, so it's hard to see anyway. Now the next big challenge was the construction of the bridge itself. And you can see I've pre-stained all of the wood, Hunter Lines Tie Brown for the color. And one thing I'll say about the wood ties here in the bridge, I think if I were to do this again, I might pay closer attention to the size of the wood, because when I went to glue the rails on top of the wood, there was a pretty big difference in height on some of those rail ties, and you couldn't actually get the glue to interface with the rail and the tie at the same time. So, you know, maybe sanding the tops of these and then staining them again later might be something you could do. Now the plan called for you to lay the ties on top of upside down tape, and you can see that's what I did there. I think if I were to do this again, I would go ahead and spot glue every one of those rail ties on top of the template, and then attempt to sand the tops of all of those and see if I could make them a lot closer to being the same height. You know, because once you get your rail put on top of that bridge there, you can turn it over and you can easily peel off that paper and do a light sanding on the underneath side, and no one's ever going to see it anyway. So I think that's what I would do again if I were to try it again. My strategy for getting the rail put on top of the ties was to go ahead and leave the plastic ties on the rail as spacing guides, and these ties just happen to fit right in between the wooden ties, so that worked pretty good. And I made sure to leave the rail long enough that I could cut it back later as needed once it gets installed into the pit. For the glue, I used both Plyobond and this Hyper Bond rubber enforced super glue. And you know, for the sake of the record, I despise any glue that immediately starts stringing the second you try and make use of it. Now my strategy was to go in strategic locations with the Plyobond and then use the rubber enforced super glue everywhere else. And it didn't work. You can see here, when I pulled the bridge up off of the tape, there were multiple ties that the glue just did not make contact at all because of the previous mentioned difference in height from the wood to the rail. So after fussing around with more of the plyo bond, I did finally get everything glued on. And then it was off to completion of the bridge, which meant laying a lot of these, I think they were 1 or 2 by 6s, and just kind of going by what the plan said. Now I'll say this about this particular kit. The instructions is a pretty brief paragraph that basically says build the kit according to the diagram. Now essentially you have 2 drawings, a down version looking straight down on the template, and then a cross section that shows the gallows. And you know, a lot of what you see is in layers, and you have to infer some things that are underneath some of the top layers. So, you know, I did the best I could. I think it turned out okay. Next up was painting all of the white metal castings. And you know, the highly visible elements are the electric motor and the gearbox, and probably the commutator that sits on top of the gallows. And you know, for whatever reason, I decided to go with blue, and I tried to kind of match the blue that's in my Otter Creek and Rio Grande logo. If you've ever noticed, it's kind of an aqua blue, if you will. And then here are the push-pull pockets and the locking dogs for the locking mechanism that sets the bridge in place once it's indexed where you want it. And these are just some pictures thrown up to kind of show what it's looking like at the moment. I'm not going to say that I'm completely finished with all of the weathering of these things. Of course, again, I used all oils. I really like the way oils work. They're very easy to work with, more so than I find acrylics to work with. The only downside is they take a lot longer to dry, but you know, if you're working on a Sunday evening and let them set for the whole week, then they're ready to go when you come back on Friday night. Now there's some fitment issues involved with the electric motor, the gearbox, and how the gearbox interfaces with the bridge itself. The motor shaft won't align with the gearbox shaft, so you have to shim up the gearbox shaft, which is no big deal. But then where the smaller pulley is supposed to go on the underneath side of the bridge, if you actually put that where the plans say it goes, it drives that gearbox really close to the bridge, and you need to be careful. If you're going to build this with standard gauge, I wouldn't put that bottom pulley where the instructions say. I would check it with your standards gauge and make sure that you've got the clearance you need, just to be on the safe side. Next, I turned my attention to the motor shack, and I decided, instead of trying to build the thing, you know, just out of framework, I went ahead and cut the overall dimensions of the building itself out of cardstock, and then laminated the 2x6 material on top of it. Now there's another smaller structure that kind of juts out from the side of the building that's a cover for the pulley, and I didn't bother building it because when it all came down to it, the shack itself absolutely would not clear a locomotive. As evidenced by the standards gauge here, you can clearly see that there's no way that a narrow gauge steam locomotive is going to roll by there. And you know, my guess is it would be even worse if this was a standard gauge steam locomotive. Now this shack was built, and the platform, you know, directly from the template. You know, the metal platform that the shack sits on, you know, there was only one way that it could go on the bridge, and I measured that, you know, before I put it on and after, when I discovered that the shack wasn't going to fit. So I'm a little confused at what Scale Structures Limited was thinking here by adding that shack. Maybe it would work for, you know, a first generation diesel locomotive, I don't know. And this shot shows, you know, how far back you'd have to push that shack in order for it to actually clear the cylinders on the locomotive, and you can see that it no longer covers the motor, so I'm probably just going to leave it off. Now, I think in all the previous pictures that you've seen to this point, I was just setting the wood ties on top of the metal bridge, and nothing had been actually glued on yet. So soldering the wires to the rail was pretty straightforward. I think I used 28 gauge stranded wire, and, you know, just tinned a little bit of the rail and stuck them on there. It was pretty easy. Now here you can see what my design was if you didn't see a good look at it earlier. I'm bringing that wire from the rail across the bridge to here on the other side of the bridge, and I intentionally left that phosphorus bronze long on top of that PCB tie so that I could very easily solder it on there later. Now I used plyo bond to glue the wood structure onto the metal structure, and after I got it glued on there, I also went in with the black rubber enforced CA and kind of tried to fill some gaps in there in the hopes that I would create a stronger bond there. I don't think it's going to go anywhere, so it's working pretty good at the moment. And here we are at the conclusion, the 482 creeping onto the bridge. I've got the wires running to a Tam Valley frog juicer. That's what's going to throw the polarity whenever the bridge turns around. And, you know, all in all, I think it's going to work. I'm still trying to formalize in my head how I'm going to motorize it, or even if I need to, which I know I don't need to, but I am going to try. So I guess look for that in an upcoming video if I'm successful with it. I guess if you never see a structure build 9.4, you'll know I failed with the motorization and am continuing to turn the table with my pointer. But I appreciate everyone's views, and thanks for watching, and we'll see you on another structure build in the future.
Oh, boy,